Nobody asks for this thought. It arrives on its own, usually late, usually when the room is quiet and there is nothing left between you and your own mind. The thought that somewhere, in some version of reality, every possible version of you exists, and the creeping suspicion that among all of them, you might be the one who turned out worst. It is a strange kind of fear, not of something external, not of danger, but of position. A feeling that across some vast, invisible ledger, your name sits at the bottom. Tonight we are going to sit with that thought instead of pushing it away, not to confirm it, not to argue against it, but to follow it, gently, slowly, through the actual science that inspired it, through the philosophy it awakens, and into something you may not expect to find at the other end. This is not a lecture. It is more like a walk through a series of rooms, each one a little deeper than the last. Some of those rooms are built from physics, others from the way the human mind constructs identity. A few exist in the space between what we know and what we can only wonder about. If you enjoy this kind of quiet exploration, you are welcome here. Stay as long as you like. And if sleep finds you before we reach the end, that is perfectly fine too. The rooms will still be here. Let us begin with the experiment that accidentally broke our understanding of reality itself. Picture a single particle of light, a photon, traveling toward a barrier with two narrow slits. On the other side, a detection screen waits. If light behaved the way most things in your daily life behave, you would expect two bands on that screen, one behind each slit, two openings, two marks. Simple. But that is not what happens. What appears instead is a pattern of many bands, alternating bright and dark stripes spreading across the screen. The kind of pattern you see when two ripples in water cross each other. An interference pattern. The photon seems to pass through both slits at the same time, interfering with itself as though it were a wave spread across space rather than a single point moving in a straight line. This alone was strange enough when it was first observed in the early 1800s, but the real shock came later, in the 20th century, when physicists tried firing photons one at a time, a single particle, alone, with no companion to interfere with. And yet, over many individual shots, the interference pattern still appeared, one photon at a time, building up the signature of a wave, as if each lone particle somehow explored both paths simultaneously. Then someone added a detector at the slits, a tiny device to watch which slit each photon actually went through. And the moment observation entered the picture, the interference pattern vanished. The photon suddenly chose one slit, behaved like a particle, produced exactly two bands. It was as though the act of looking forced the universe to make a decision. This was not a minor puzzle at the edges of physics. It became the central mystery of quantum mechanics, the measurement problem. Before observation, a particle exists in what physicists call a superposition, a mathematical blend of every possible state it could occupy. After observation, it becomes one definite thing. The transition between those two states, between everything possible and one thing actual, had no clear mechanism, no explanation for why or how it happened. For decades, the dominant answer was to simply accept it. The Copenhagen interpretation, as it came to be known, essentially said, do not ask what the particle is doing before you look. The question has no meaning. Reality, in some sense, only becomes real when it is measured, and most physicists were satisfied with that. Or at least, they agreed not to press the issue too loudly. But a few minds could not leave it alone, because the equation that governs quantum behavior, the Schrödinger equation, never describes a collapse. It describes something that simply keeps evolving, branching, spreading into more and more possibilities without ever settling into one. If you trusted the math entirely, the collapse never happened at all, and that one quiet observation would eventually lead to an idea so enormous that most of the physics community refused to look at it for nearly 2 decades. One evening in 1954, at Princeton University, 3 young men sat drinking sherry and talking about the strangeness of quantum mechanics. One was Charles Misner, a student of the legendary physicist John Archibald Wheeler. Another was Age Peterson, visiting from Copenhagen where he worked as an assistant to Niels Bohr himself, one of the founding architects of quantum theory. The third was a quiet, mathematically gifted graduate student named Hugh Everett III. The sherry flowed generously. The conversation turned to the measurement problem, that nagging question of what happens when a quantum system is observed. Why does the superposition vanish? Where do all the other possibilities go? Everett proposed something that sounded at first almost absurd. What if they do not go anywhere? What if every possibility in the superposition actually happens, but each one happens in its own separate branch of reality, not metaphorically, not as a mathematical convenience, but literally? Every time a quantum event has more than one possible outcome, the universe splits. Both outcomes occur. Both are real. They simply can no longer see each other. The idea was elegant in a dangerous way. It solved the measurement problem by removing the need for collapse entirely. The Schrödinger equation was already describing everything that happens. Physicists had just been assuming, without evidence, that part of the process must stop at some point. Everett said, "What if it never stops?" He developed this into his doctoral thesis, submitted in 1957. Wheeler, his advisor, supported him but also tried to soften the language, aware of how radical it would sound. The thesis was eventually shortened under pressure. The broader physics community mostly ignored it. Bohr's circle found it unnecessary. Many dismissed it outright. Everett did not fight for his idea. He quietly left academia without ever applying for a single professorship. He took a position with the Department of Defense, working on nuclear weapons strategy, game theory, and optimization. He started companies. He lived intensely and privately. And in 1982, at the age of 51, he died of a sudden heart attack. He never knew that his abandoned idea would eventually become one of the most seriously debated interpretations in all of physics. That physicists like Sean Carroll, David Deutsch, and David Wallace would build rigorous arguments in its favor decades later. That his quiet suggestion, scribbled first in the glow of too much sherry, would one day be called the many worlds interpretation, and the heart of it remains startlingly simple. The math of quantum mechanics, taken at face value, describes a universe that never chooses, it only branches. And if that is true, then every version of every event that the equations allow is unfolding right now, somewhere, in a reality just as real as the one you are lying in tonight. There is something about the word splitting that creates the wrong picture. It sounds dramatic, like a tree struck by lightning, cracking down the center. People imagine a sudden rupture, a cosmic fork in the road where reality pauses, considers two paths, and tears itself in half. The actual process is nothing like that. It is silent, imperceptible, and it happens so often that by the time you reach the end of this sentence, it may have occurred more times than you could count in a lifetime. The mechanism behind it is called decoherence, and understanding it changes everything about how the many worlds picture feels. Here is the simplest way to think about it. When a quantum system, say, a tiny particle in superposition, interacts with its surrounding environment, something irreversible happens. The different possibilities that were coexisting in that superposition become entangled with the larger world around them. And once that entanglement takes hold, the different branches can no longer interfere with each other. They become, for all practical purposes, invisible to one another. It is not that a wall drops between them. It is more like two conversations happening in the same room that gradually drift so far apart in topic, tone, and language that they become mutually inaudible. The information is still there, nothing has been erased, but the channels are now so thoroughly mixed into the background noise of reality that no observation, no measurement, no technology could ever untangle them again. This is the key insight. Decoherence does not require anyone to look. It does not need a conscious observer. A rock can cause it. A stray photon can cause it. The air in the room you are in right now is causing it. Constantly, with every particle that bumps against every other particle in the dark. The universe in this picture does not branch because someone makes a decision. It branches because particles interact. And particles interact relentlessly, in your lungs, in the walls, in the faint warmth radiating from your skin at this very moment. There is something both humbling and oddly soothing about that. The splitting is not about you. It is not triggered by your choices or your awareness. It is simply what matter does when it touches other matter, following rules that were in place long before any mind existed to notice. You did not choose any of this. None of your counterparts did either. The branching is not something that happens to people. It is something that happens to physics. And people, all versions of them, simply ride along inside it, each one experiencing their own thread as though it were the only one. Imagine trying to write down a single description of everything. Not everything on Earth, not everything in the solar system, everything, every particle, every field, every interaction across the entire observable universe, and beyond it too, captured in one mathematical object. That is what Everett proposed. He called it the universal wave function, and the idea behind it is both simple and enormous. In standard quantum mechanics, a wave function describes the possible states of a single system, an electron, a photon, a molecule. It contains all the information about what that system might do when something interacts with it. Everett's step was to ask, why should this description stop at small things? If quantum mechanics governs particles, and particles are what everything is made of, then the same rules should apply to everything. The planet, the stars, you, the entire cosmos. There should be one wave function, one vast, evolving mathematical structure that contains every possible configuration of reality within it. And the remarkable part, the part that changes how you feel about your place in things, in this picture, there is no outside, there is no external observer standing apart from the universe, collapsing possibilities by looking in. The wave function includes the observers, it includes the instruments, it includes the act of looking itself. Consciousness in this framework holds no special power. A human watching an experiment does not cause reality to choose. The human simply becomes entangled with the result, woven into the branching structure along with everything else. An earthworm passing through soil causes the same kind of entanglement. So does a grain of dust drifting through a beam of light. That might feel unsettling at first. The idea that your awareness, your sense of being the one who sees, is not doing anything special in the physics. But sit with it a moment longer, and something else emerges. If consciousness is not collapsing the wave function, if it is not forcing reality to pick one path, then reality was never waiting for you to look. It was already doing everything. Your experience of one particular outcome is not because the universe chose that outcome for you. It is because you are inside one thread of a much larger fabric, and from inside a thread, the fabric looks like a single line. Some physicists find this deeply elegant. Others find it deeply troubling. The debate is far from settled, and honest thinkers hold positions across the full spectrum. But the mathematical structure itself is clean, continuous, and free of the awkward discontinuity that the old collapse picture required. Whether or not this is what reality actually does, the idea itself invites a shift. Instead of imagining the universe as a single story with one narrator, you begin to glimpse something more like a library, vast, quiet, and containing every possible book, including the one you are living through right now. Numbers have a way of losing their meaning when they get large enough. 1,000,000 feels graspable, 1,000,000,000 begins to blur, 1,000,000,000,000 is already more of an abstraction than an amount, but the scale implied by the many worlds picture does not live anywhere on that familiar number line. Consider a single second of activity inside your body. In that second, roughly 10 trillion chemical reactions take place within your cells. Each of those reactions involves quantum-level events, electron transitions, molecular vibrations, photon absorptions, any one of which might, under the right conditions, produce a branching. Now multiply that by every atom in every cell, and then by every organism on the planet, and then by every grain of dust, every star, every photon crossing the space between galaxies. The number of branches being generated at any given moment is not just large, it is a quantity for which human language has no honest container. Every number ever spoken, written, or imagined by any person in the history of civilization would not come close to representing the branching that may have occurred since the beginning of this sentence. There is a temptation to hear that and recoil, to feel crushed by it. How can anything matter if it is one strand among a number too large to name? But consider a different angle. The grains of sand on every beach on Earth number roughly 7 quintillion, a 7 followed by 18 zeros. No one has ever argued that a single grain of sand is meaningless because there are many grains. A beach is not diminished by its abundance. If anything, it is defined by it. The many-world structure, if it is real, would not be a void in which things get lost. It would be a fullness in which every possible configuration of matter and energy is expressed, not through repetition, but through variation, each branch carrying a slightly different version of events, a slightly different sequence of interactions, a slightly different arrangement of the particles that happen to compose what you call you. Some physicists, like David Deutsch, have argued that this staggering multiplicity is not a flaw of the interpretation, it is the very reason the interpretation works. The interference patterns in quantum experiments, the strange correlations that have no classical explanation, they make perfect sense if the math is describing exactly what it appears to describe, a reality of unimaginable breadth, operating beneath the thin surface of what any one branch can perceive. You do not need to accept this as certain. It remains one proposed picture among several. But even as a possibility, even as a thought experiment held loosely in mind, it recalibrates something about proportion. You are not small because the structure is large. You are specific. And specificity, in a framework of endless variation, might be the rarest thing there is. It would be easy at this point to speak as if the many worlds interpretation were simply true, as if physicists had opened a door and confirmed, beyond doubt, that parallel branches of reality are humming alongside this one right now. But honesty requires a more careful step. The many worlds interpretation is exactly that, an interpretation. It is one way of making sense of the mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics, and it happens to be a way that takes the math more literally than most, but it is not the only option on the table. The Copenhagen interpretation, still widely taught, holds that the wave function does not describe reality directly, but rather our knowledge of possible outcomes. In that view, there are no other branches. There is just uncertainty, collapsing into fact when a measurement occurs. It is a leaner picture, though it comes with its own costs, like never quite explaining what counts as a measurement or why collapse happens. Another perspective, the pilot wave theory proposed by David Bohm, keeps particles as definite objects at all times, guided by a wave. It avoids both collapse and branching, but it requires a hidden layer of reality that many physicists find uncomfortable. Still others have explored relational interpretations, information theoretic approaches, and frameworks that treat quantum mechanics as a tool for prediction rather than a map of what exists. The honest truth is that no experiment currently performed can distinguish between these interpretations. They all predict the same results for every test we know how to run. The difference is not in the physics, but in the story we tell about what the physics means. This matters, especially tonight, because the question at the heart of this journey, what if you are the worst version of yourself across all universes, rests on the premise that those other versions exist. And the answer from physics, as of now, is perhaps. The math is consistent with it. Some very serious thinkers believe it. Others, equally serious, do not. And that uncertainty is not a failure. It is the actual state of human understanding at this point in history. The universe does not owe us a clean answer. It offers clues, patterns, equations that work beautifully without fully explaining themselves. What the many worlds picture does offer, even if held as a possibility rather than a certainty, is a lens, a way of thinking about identity, about choice, about meaning, that opens doors which the everyday view of reality keeps shut. And those doors are worth walking through, carefully, humbly, without mistaking the walking for proof that the rooms behind them are definitely there. So let us continue forward with that honesty intact, holding the framework gently as a contemplation rather than a conclusion, and turning now from the physics of branching to a far more personal question. If there are other versions of you, are they really you at all? There is a thought experiment that has been troubling careful thinkers for over 2,000 years. The ancient Greek historian Plutarch described it first, though the problem almost certainly existed in conversation long before he wrote it down. A ship belongs to the hero Theseus. Over time, as planks rot and sails wear thin, each piece is replaced with a new one board at a time, one rope, one nail, and eventually, after years of repair, not a single original piece remains. Every component of the ship is new. Is it still the same ship? Most people hesitate. Something about the continuity, the fact that the ship was never dismantled, that it remained in use throughout, that the changes happened gradually, makes it feel like the same vessel. But if someone had gathered all the old planks as they were removed and built a second ship from them, you would now have two ships, and both could claim to be the original. This is not really a question about ships. It is a question about what makes something itself, and if you press it far enough, it becomes a question about what makes you yourself. Your body replaces most of its cells over the course of roughly 7 to 10 years. The atoms in your bones, your skin, your blood, almost none of them were there a decade ago. The molecules that carry your thoughts tonight are not the molecules that carried them when you were 20. In a very material sense, you have already been rebuilt from scratch multiple times in the course of your life, yet you feel continuous. You remember yesterday. You recognize your name. The thread of experience seems unbroken even though the fabric has been replaced completely. Now transplant this puzzle into the many worlds framework. At every branching, a version of you continues along each path. Both versions carry the same memories up to the point of splitting. Both feel continuous, both would claim to be the real you, but they are not the same person. They will have different experiences from the moment of divergence onward, different thoughts, different feelings, eventually different memories entirely. They share an origin, the way two rivers share a headwater, but they are no longer one river. So what is the you that persists across branches? Is there a core identity that all versions share? Or does identity fracture at the moment of splitting, the way a cell divides into two organisms that are related but independent? The philosopher Derek Parfit spent much of his career exploring exactly this. He argued that our ordinary concept of personal identity, the idea that there is one continuous self stretching from birth to death, might be more fragile than it appears. What matters, Parfit suggested, is not identity in the strict logical sense, but psychological connectedness, the chain of memories, intentions, and personality traits that link one moment to the next. And in a branching universe, that chain does not break at the split, it duplicates. Which means identity, in Parfit's view, might not be the kind of thing that can survive duplication without transforming into something new. The philosopher David Lewis spent years building one of the most ambitious metaphysical systems of the 20th century. At its center was a claim that many people found either thrilling or outrageous. Every possible world is real, not just as an abstract idea, not just as a useful fiction for thinking about what might have been. Real in the same way this world is real, concrete, physical, existing somewhere in the totality of what there is. Lewis called this view modal realism, and one of its most striking consequences has to do with you. In Lewis's framework, no individual exists in more than one world. You are here, in this world, and nowhere else. The person in another possible world who looks like you, shares your memories up to a point, and lives out a life you almost lived. That person is not you, they are your counterpart. Close, recognizable, bearing enough resemblance that it makes sense to call them a version of you. But they are a separate individual, as distinct from you as a sibling you have never met. This is a subtler distinction than it first appears. When people imagine parallel universes, they tend to picture copies of themselves, identical beings leading alternate lives. But Lewis would say that is not what is happening. A copy implies the same thing in two places. A counterpart implies two different things that bear a deep resemblance. Think of it this way. You might have a cousin who grew up in another country who shares your grandparents, your bone structure, even some of your mannerisms. If you met them, you would see yourself reflected in their face. but you would never confuse them for you. They have their own inner life, their own trajectory, their own joys and regrets. The resemblance is real, but the identity is not shared. Lewis argued that the same logic applies across possible worlds. Your counterpart in another branch is not living your unlived life. They are living their life, a life that happens to share a deep structural kinship with yours. And this kinship is what makes it meaningful to talk about them as a version of you, without collapsing the distinction between two separate beings. This does something unexpected to the question we started with. What if you are the worst version of yourself? Assumes that all versions are somehow the same self, ranked on a single scale. But if Lewis is right, the comparison breaks down at the foundation. You are not competing with your counterparts any more than you are competing with a cousin you will never meet, living a life you will never see. The fear of being the worst depends on the versions being the same person, and one serious philosophical tradition says they are not. They are kin, they are echoes, but each one is their own sovereign center of experience, their own point of irreducible existence. Whether or not you find Lewis convincing, and plenty of philosophers do not, the possibility itself loosens something. It suggests that the self might not be the kind of thing that stretches across worlds. It might be the kind of thing that belongs, entirely and only, to the one world it inhabits. Long before physicists started talking about branching universes, psychologists noticed that human beings already live with multiple versions of themselves, not in physical reality but in the architecture of their own minds. In 1986, two researchers named Hazel Marcus and Paula Nurius introduced a concept they called possible selves. The idea was deceptively simple. At any given moment, your sense of who you are is not limited to who you are right now. It includes a whole gallery of selves you might become, selves you hope to become, and, perhaps most powerfully, selves you are afraid of becoming. The successful self, the failed self, the self who finally writes the book, the self who never recovers from the loss. These are not fantasies. They are active psychological structures that shape motivation, emotion, and behavior in measurable ways. Marcus and Nurius found that the vividness of a possible self, how real it felt, how easily a person could picture it, directly influenced how that person acted in the present. A person with a clear image of their ideal future self was more likely to take steps toward it. A person haunted by a vivid feared self was more likely to experience anxiety and avoidance. In other words, the selves that do not exist are shaping the self that does. Sit with that for a moment. Your brain is running simulations of people you have never been, and those simulations are influencing the person you are becoming tonight. The boundary between real and imagined turns out to be far blurrier than it seems from the inside. Now here is where it gets strange. If the many worlds interpretation holds, then possible selves are not just mental constructs. They are descriptions of counterparts who actually exist. The successful version of you is not a daydream. It is a person in a branch living a life. The version you are most afraid of becoming is not a nightmare. It is someone real, somewhere, carrying a consciousness just as vivid as yours. This convergence, psychology meeting physics, produces a peculiar kind of vertigo. The gallery of selves that your brain maintains for motivation and self-regulation might, in some theoretical sense, correspond to actual beings, the hoped for you, the dreaded you, the one who made a different choice 10 years ago, each occupying a branch of reality that your mind has been modeling all along, without knowing it had a physical counterpart. It does not mean the models are accurate. Your imagined future self and an actual counterpart in another branch would not match in detail, but the resonance is there. The human mind, it seems, is built to think in parallel versions, to simulate branching paths as a way of navigating the one path it actually walks. And the version you fear the most, the one you stay up at night worrying about becoming, may tell you more about the structure of your own psychology than about any real branch of the multiverse. There is a feeling that almost every person alive recognizes, even if they have never given it a name. You see someone who has something you want, a career, a relationship, a kind of ease in the world, and something tightens in your chest. Not quite envy, not quite sadness, more like a quiet measurement being taken without your permission. In 1954, the social psychologist Leon Festinger published a theory about this feeling. He called it social comparison, and his central claim was that human beings have an innate drive to evaluate their own abilities and opinions, not in absolute terms, but by comparing themselves to others. This was not a flaw, Festinger argued. It was a feature. In evolutionary terms, knowing where you stand relative to others in your group could mean the difference between survival and elimination. Are you strong enough to compete? Skilled enough to contribute? Valued enough to be protected? These assessments are not vanity. They are ancient calculations running on hardware that was shaped long before the concept of self-esteem existed. The problem is that this hardware was designed for small groups, a few dozen people, a tribe, a village. Your brain evolved to compare you to the people immediately around you, the ones whose abilities and resources directly affected your survival. Now consider what happens when that same system is placed inside a modern mind. You are no longer comparing yourself to 30 people in a village. You are comparing yourself to thousands of curated images on a screen, to highlight reels of strangers' best moments, to carefully edited versions of lives you know nothing about. And the multiverse thought experiment takes this even further. It asks you to compare yourself not just to other people, but to other versions of yourself, versions who share your genetics, your starting conditions, your potential, but who branched into different outcomes. It is as though the comparison drive, which was already straining under the weight of modern information, is now being asked to measure you against an infinite array of people who are simultaneously you and not you. That is a task the human mind was never equipped for. The emotional machinery of social comparison does not have a setting for infinite. It does not know how to process the idea that somewhere a version of you made every right decision, while another version made every wrong one. It just keeps measuring, keeps tightening, keeps producing that nameless feeling in the chest. But here is something Festinger himself noted, something that often gets lost in the discussion. Comparison is not always harmful. Upward comparison, measuring yourself against someone doing better, can motivate. Downward comparison, recognizing that others have it harder, can comfort. The damage comes not from the comparison itself, but from the belief that the comparison is final, that the measurement is permanent, that the position it reveals is fixed. In a branching universe, nothing is fixed. The measurement was taken at one moment, in one branch, under one set of conditions. It is not a verdict, it is a snapshot, and by the time you finish processing it, both you and the structure you are comparing yourself to have already changed. Suppose for a moment that the multiverse is real. Suppose there are countless versions of you, each living out a different permutation of every choice, every accident, every interaction that quantum mechanics allows. Now ask the question directly, which one is the worst? The answer seems obvious at first. The one with the most suffering, the one whose life contains the most pain, the least joy, the fewest moments of meaning. But the moment you try to pin this down, it begins to dissolve. Is the worst version the one who is poorest? Some of the most content people in recorded history owned almost nothing. Is it the one who is sickest? Illness, for all its cruelty, sometimes opens doors to insight and connection that health never approached. Is it the one who is most alone? Solitude has driven people mad, but it has also been the condition under which some of the deepest human thought was produced. The word worst requires a measuring stick, and every measuring stick encodes a set of values. Success, happiness, achievement, connection, purpose. Each of these points to a different ranking, and a version of you who scores lowest on one scale might score highest on another. A life that looks like a failure from the outside might contain an interior richness that no observer could detect. A life that looks enviable might be experienced, from within, as hollow. The version of you who never left a small town might have a depth of rootedness that the version who traveled the world never found. The version who achieved everything might lie awake at night feeling exactly the way you feel right now, wondering if it was enough. This is not just philosophical cleverness. It points to something fundamental about the nature of evaluation. Ranking requires a single axis, but lives are not single-axis phenomena. They are multidimensional, textured, shifting, and contradictory. Compressing all of that into a word like worst is like compressing a symphony into a single note. The note might be accurate in one narrow sense, but it erases almost everything that matters. There is another problem, more subtle and perhaps more important. The value system you are using to judge these lives, the standards by which you determine what counts as good or bad, better or worse, was itself produced by your specific branch. Your culture shaped it, your experiences refined it, your particular sequence of joys and disappointments calibrated it. A version of you in a different branch, with different experiences, would hold a different value system, and by their standards, your life might be the worst or the best, for reasons you would not even recognize as valid. So when the thought arrives at night, I might be the worst one, it is worth pausing to ask, worst by whose definition, and whether any single definition, born inside a single branch, could ever claim authority over all the others. The multiverse, if it exists, does not come with a key. There is no master scale hidden in the physics. There are only perspectives, countless, irreconcilable, each valid within its own frame and meaningless outside it. There is a deep assumption embedded in the fear of being the worst version, that somewhere, somehow, there exists a complete ranking, a list, a ledger, some cosmic system that has weighed every branch and placed each version of you in order, from best to worst, with your name settled at the bottom. But nothing in physics, philosophy, or logic supports the existence of such a system. Start with physics. The many worlds interpretation, in its mathematical form, describes branches as vectors in an abstract space called Hilbert space. These vectors evolve according to the Schrödinger equation. They do not carry labels like good branch or bad branch. The formalism is utterly indifferent to human value. It tracks amplitudes, probabilities, entanglement, not quality of life, not meaning, not the feeling of having fallen short. The structure of quantum mechanics is no more capable of ranking your life than a thermometer is capable of judging a painting. Now consider philosophy. Even if you could somehow access every branch and examine every version of every life, you would face what philosophers call the problem of incommensurability. Some values cannot be translated into a common currency. How do you weigh a life of adventure against a life of devotion? How do you compare the suffering of loneliness to the suffering of regret? These are not quantities that can be summed and sorted. They resist reduction. They refuse to sit neatly on a single axis. The economist Kenneth Arrow demonstrated something related in a different domain, that no ranking system can consistently aggregate individual preferences into a collective order without violating at least one principle that seems obviously fair. The problem is structural, not technical. It is not that we have not found the right formula. It is that no formula can do what we are asking it to do. Applied to lives across a multiverse, this means the ranking itself is impossible, not just difficult, not just beyond current knowledge, but logically incoherent. There is no position from which all lives could be fairly evaluated, because the criteria for fairness differ across every possible branch, and this impossibility is not a consolation prize, it is the actual structure of the situation. The cosmic scoreboard does not exist not because it has not been built yet, but because the concept contains a contradiction. It asks for a universal standard in a framework defined by the absence of universality. So where does the feeling of ranking come from? It comes from inside, from the human mind's relentless drive to position itself, to measure, to compare, a drive that evolved for survival in small groups and now runs without a shutdown switch, applying itself to problems it was never designed to solve. The fear of being the worst version is not a discovery about reality. It is a projection, a mental habit operating in a domain where it has no jurisdiction, and recognizing this does not make the feeling vanish. Feelings rarely obey logic, but it might loosen the grip just slightly, just enough to wonder whether the scoreboard you have been dreading was never there at all, just enough to let the shoulders drop half an inch, just enough to consider the possibility that you have been fearing a judgment that no part of the universe is equipped to make. There is something heavy about the many worlds idea that does not get discussed as often as the elegant mathematics behind it. It hides in a logical corner, and most people do not notice it until the thought lands squarely in their chest at some quiet hour. If every outcome that quantum mechanics allows actually occurs, then suffering is not an accident. It is a structural feature of reality itself. Let that settle. Not the suffering you have experienced personally, though that is real enough, but the implication that somewhere, in some branch, every form of pain that could possibly happen to a human being is happening, not as a risk, not as a possibility, as a certainty written into the architecture of the branching tree. This includes the branches where you specifically endure the worst version of your life. The many worlds framework does not select who suffers and who does not. It does not grade on a curve. It simply exhausts every configuration. And among those configurations, by the sheer mathematics of completeness, there are branches that contain every form of loss, failure, and anguish that your particular life could contain. Some have called this the problem of evil in the multiverse, a phrase borrowed from theology but applied to physics. In a single universe, suffering can be understood as contingent, bad luck, wrong place, wrong time. But in a multiverse, suffering becomes necessary. It is not that it might happen, it must happen. The equations guarantee it. And yet, here is where the thought turns in an unexpected direction. The same logic that guarantees suffering also guarantees its opposite. Every configuration of joy that your life could possibly contain is also realized somewhere. Every recovery, every unexpected kindness, every moment of peace you thought was lost, all of those play out too. The branching tree does not favor one side. It expresses the full range. This does not cancel the weight of the suffering. Knowing that joy exists in another branch does not ease the pain in yours, but it shifts the picture from a hierarchy to a symmetry. The structure is not designed to produce winners and losers. It produces everything. The darkness and the light are twins, inseparable, co-arising, equally embedded in the mathematics. For many thinkers, this is deeply uncomfortable. It challenges the idea that suffering should be reduced, because in the multiverse, it cannot be eliminated, only redistributed across branches. For others, it prompts a different question. Not why does suffering exist, but what does suffering mean when it is guaranteed? And perhaps the most human response is not to answer, but to simply notice the weight of the question. To acknowledge that a framework capable of producing every possible version of a life, including the worst one, is not something the mind can fully absorb. Some truths are too large to hold. They can only be sat beside, the way you sit beside an ocean, knowing its depth without needing to measure it. The inevitability does not have to feel like a trap. It might instead feel like the ground, something you cannot escape, something you did not choose, but something that holds everything equally, without preference, without judgment. Late at night, the mind has a habit of turning inward, reviewing decisions, replaying conversations, asking whether you should have said something different, done something braver, been something more. The internal courtroom is always in session at 2 a.m, and it does not employ a defense attorney. Now place that courtroom inside a branching universe and watch what happens to the proceedings. In the many worlds interpretation, as some physicists describe it, every outcome that quantum mechanics permits occurs with certainty across the full structure of branches. This means that every choice you agonize over at night, every road not taken, every word swallowed, every risk avoided, was taken, spoken, and embraced in some other branch. Not by a separate person making a separate decision, but by the deterministic unfolding of the universal wave function. Here is the tension. If everything that can happen does happen, was any of it really a choice? The many worlds framework, taken at face value, is deterministic, not in the old clockwork sense where the future is a single fixed path, but in a broader sense. The total evolution of all branches is determined by the initial conditions and the equation governing the wave function. Within any given branch, it feels like you chose, but from the perspective of the entire structure, every option was always going to be realized. This raises a question that has haunted philosophers for centuries, now dressed in new clothing. If your actions were determined, if the version of you who acted badly was always going to exist, can you be held responsible for what you did? Some philosophers argue that determinism and moral responsibility are compatible. This position, called compatibilism, suggests that what matters is not whether your actions were determined in an ultimate sense, but whether they flowed from your own desires, beliefs, and character. You are responsible not because you could have done otherwise in some absolute way, but because the action came from you, from the particular configuration of thoughts and values that constitute the person you are in this branch. Others disagree. They argue that genuine moral responsibility requires the ability to have truly done otherwise, that without that alternative, praise and blame become empty gestures, performances without foundation. The multiverse complicates both positions. The compatibilist can point to your branch and say, "Here, your character determined your actions, and that is enough." But the hard determinist can point to the larger structure and say, "Your character itself was determined, and every alternative expression of it exists elsewhere, so the very concept of your character is just one slice of a much larger, fully determined whole." And the person lying awake, running the trial in their own mind, might find something unexpected in all of this. Not an excuse, not a dismissal, but perhaps a softening. If the version of you that made the mistake was always going to exist, not because you are weak, but because the structure of reality exhausts all possibilities, then the failure is not a verdict on your worth. It is a feature of the framework. It was going to happen to someone wearing your face, carrying your memories, feeling your particular shade of regret. This does not erase accountability. Actions within a branch still have consequences within that branch. The people affected by your choices still feel those effects, but it might ease the cruelty of the late-night courtroom just slightly, replacing the question, "How could you?" with the gentler, stranger recognition that in an exhaustive structure, every version of you could, and you did, and you didn't exist simultaneously, none of them more real than the others. One of the most popular images in science fiction is the meeting of alternate selves, two versions of the same person, face to face, exchanging stories about the different lives they led. It makes for compelling drama. The successful version confronts the broken one. The hero meets the villain they could have become. The laundromat owner stares into the eyes of the movie star she never was. But the physics, as far as anyone can tell, makes this impossible. Decoherence, the process by which quantum branches separate, is not a curtain you can pull aside. It is an irreversible entanglement between a quantum system and its environment, so thorough that no practical operation could ever undo it. The information that would allow two branches to interfere with each other again is not hidden behind a locked door. It is dispersed across every particle in the environment, scrambled into the thermal noise of the universe, and effectively erased from any accessible record. The physicist Wojciech Zurek, who developed much of the modern theory of decoherence, described it as a process that happens extraordinarily fast, on timescales so short that they make the blink of an eye look like a geological epoch. For any system large enough to involve molecules, atoms in a warm environment, or particles interacting with light, coherence between branches is lost almost instantly. The walls go up before anyone inside could notice they were ever down. This means your counterparts, if they exist, are permanently unreachable. You cannot send them a message. You cannot learn from their mistakes. You cannot be consoled by the version of you who found peace, and you cannot warn the version of you who is walking toward disaster. Each branch is a sealed room, and consciousness is the light that illuminates only the one it occupies. There is something lonely in that image, but there is also something unexpectedly tender, because if the walls are absolute, then every version of you is in exactly the same position. The successful one does not know about you. The suffering one does not know about the successful one. No version has the advantage of perspective across branches. Each one lives entirely within their own strand, experiencing it as the whole of reality. navigating it with nothing but the information available within their particular sealed room. And that changes the emotional texture of the question. What if you are the worst version? Carries an implicit comparison, as if there is a vantage point from which all versions are visible and yours falls short, but no such vantage point exists. Not for you, not for any version of you, not for any observer anywhere in the structure. The comparison is happening only inside your mind, your sealed, singular, particular mind, the one that has never seen another branch and never will. The one that has constructed an entire hierarchy of imagined selves based on nothing but the projection of possibility onto the blank wall of an inaccessible reality. The counterparts are not watching, they are not judging, they are not even aware of the competition. They are simply living, each inside their own room, each navigating their own version of the dark, each carrying the same fundamental uncertainty about their own position in a structure none of them can see, and somehow knowing that the walls are real, that the separation is total and permanent, makes the loneliness feel less like isolation and more like a shared condition. Every version of you is alone in exactly the same way, and there is a strange equality in that. Close your eyes for a moment, not to sleep, not yet, and notice something small. You can choose to focus on the sound in the room or on the weight of your body against the surface beneath you. Right now, in this moment, it feels entirely up to you which one receives your attention. That feeling, the sense that you are the author of your next thought, the selector of your next action, is one of the most immediate experiences a human being can have. It is more vivid than any philosophical argument about whether it is real, and in a branching universe, it sits in a peculiar position. If every quantum event that could go differently does go differently, and if the choices you make are influenced, even slightly, by quantum-level processes in the brain, then every option you consider is realized somewhere. The version that focuses on the sound exists. The version that focuses on the weight exists. Both paths are taken, neither is abandoned. From the outside, from the God's eye view of the entire branching structure, nothing was really chosen. Everything happened. Choice, from that vantage, is an illusion, a trick of perspective that arises because each branch can only see itself. But you do not live outside, you live inside. And from inside a branch, the experience of choosing is not diminished by the fact that another branch took the other path. In your world, the only one accessible to you, you deliberated, you weighed, you selected, and the consequences of that selection are real within this branch, felt by you and everyone your actions touch. Some philosophers argue that this is enough, that free will does not need to be a metaphysical absolute to be meaningful. What matters is that your actions flow from your reasoning, your values, your character, not from external compulsion. This view, sometimes called compatibilism, holds that freedom is not about the absence of determinism but about the presence of self-governance. You are free when you act in accordance with who you are, even if who you are was shaped by forces you did not control. Others push back. They insist that genuine freedom requires the genuine ability to have done otherwise. Not in some other branch, but in this one. If the laws of physics determined that you would choose exactly as you did, then the deliberation was theatre, and the sense of authorship was a comforting hallucination. But tonight, lying here, a third possibility is worth holding gently. Perhaps the question of whether free will is real in some ultimate metaphysical sense is less important than the question of what the experience of free will does for the person having it. Because it does something. The sense of agency shapes how you relate to your own decisions. It influences regret, pride, motivation, and hope. It gives the present moment a weight it would not have if you believed, truly, deeply believed, that nothing you did was up to you. In a branching universe, the experience of choosing might be local, confined to one branch, not a statement about the totality of reality. But local does not mean false. A fire is local, it still warms. A song is local, it still moves. And the felt sense of making a decision, even if it is happening simultaneously with every alternative in every other branch, is still the realest thing inside the room where you are right now. Still breathing, still listening, still in every way that matters to you, choosing to stay awake a little longer. Memory has a particular quality late at night. It softens. The edges of old scenes lose their sharpness, and the past takes on a kind of golden weight. Not necessarily warm, but thick, dense, full of something the present moment seems to lack. You remember the afternoon differently now than you did at the time. The conversation that seemed ordinary has become precious. The choice you barely noticed has become the hinge of everything that followed, and somewhere beneath the remembering, a whisper. What if I had turned the other way? In the many worlds picture, this question has a strange answer. You did turn the other way. Or rather, a version of you did. The branch where you stayed is as real as the branch where you left. The branch where you spoke is as real as the branch where you stayed silent. Both exist. Both continue. Both are sealed from each other permanently. But here is what the physics adds to the heartache of nostalgia. The branching only moves forward. Decoherence creates new branches at every quantum interaction, but it does not create them backward. The past is not a tree of possibilities. It is a single thread, the one path that led to this exact configuration of your neurons, your breath, your position in this bed. The future may still branch in ways that cannot be predicted from within a single strand, but the past, from your perspective, has already narrowed to one line. This asymmetry branching forward, fixed backward, means that nostalgia is a longing for something that was never available. Not because the past was not real, but because the other versions of the past were never part of your branch. The afternoon you remember differently, the choice you wish you had made, those belong to a counterpart's history, not yours. Your history is the sequence that brought you here, and here is the only place any version of you has ever actually been. There is something painful in that recognition, but there is also something clarifying. If the past cannot branch, then regret, however natural, is directed at a door that was never open. Not a door that closed, but a door that existed only in the architecture of another branch. A branch that diverged from yours at the quantum level before the choice was even consciously made. The decision you agonize over may not have been the branching point at all. The split may have happened in a molecular event so small, so far below the threshold of awareness, that no amount of reflection could identify it. This does not mean regret is irrational. The feeling is real, and feelings do not require metaphysical justification. But it loosens the story that regret likes to tell, the story that you were standing at a fork and chose wrong. In a branching universe, you were never standing at a fork. You were always on a single path, experiencing the forward edge of a structure that was splitting around you at every moment, at scales too small to perceive. The corridor behind you was always single file. It only looks wide in memory because memory does not respect the rules of decoherence. Memory imagines possibilities that were never part of this branch, and the ache of the past is, in some sense, homesickness for a world you never inhabited. Tomorrow, new branches will open. The future still has width, but tonight, the past is exactly what it was. One path, fully walked, entirely yours, and the version of you who walks it has never been anywhere else. There comes a moment, usually deep inside the exploration of an idea like this, where the mind reaches a kind of ledge. The view is too wide, the scale is too large, and a quiet voice from somewhere inside says, "If everything happens, then nothing I do matters." This is not a weak thought. It is not a sign of intellectual failure or emotional fragility. It is the honest response of a meaning-seeking creature confronting a framework that seems to dissolve the very foundations of meaning. If every achievement you have ever worked for also fails in another branch, if every relationship you have built also falls apart somewhere, if every moment of kindness you have offered is also withheld by a counterpart, then what exactly is the point? The effort and its opposite coexist. The victory and the defeat are simultaneous. The entire spectrum of human experience, from the most sublime to the most agonizing, is played out in full, with no version being more real or more important than any other. This is the nihilism that lives at the edge of infinity, and it is worth taking seriously, because pretending it does not exist only makes it louder when the lights go off. The film Everything Everywhere All at Once explored this terrain with unusual honesty. Its protagonist, a woman named Evelyn, is told directly that she is the worst version of herself across all universes, and her daughter, or rather a version of her daughter whose mind has been fractured by exposure to every possible reality simultaneously, arrives at a conclusion that sounds at first like pure nihilism. Nothing matters. The universe is chaos. Meaning is a local hallucination. The symbol of this nihilism in the film is a everything bagel, a swirling void containing every topping, every ingredient, every possibility compressed into a single point that threatens to consume everything. It is both absurd and deeply accurate as a metaphor for what happens when the mind tries to hold infinite possibility all at once. But here is the part that often gets missed. The nihilism in the film is not presented as the final answer. It is presented as a stage, a real and necessary stage that arises when a finite mind tries to process infinite scope. It is the darkness you pass through, not the darkness you arrive at. And the passage matters, because the alternative to nihilism is not naive optimism. It is not pretending the infinite branches do not exist or that suffering is somehow illusory. The alternative is something subtler. The recognition that meaning does not require universality. A meal does not fail because it feeds one person instead of everyone. A conversation does not lose its value because it happened in one room instead of every room. And a life, one particular, imperfect, struggling life, does not lose its significance because other lives exist alongside it, any more than a note in a symphony loses its significance because other notes are playing at the same time. But arriving at that recognition requires passing through the void first, sitting with the vertigo, allowing the nihilism to make its case fully before discovering that the case, while internally consistent, leaves out something important, the felt experience of being the one who is here. The branches are sealed. That simple physical fact, the irreversibility of decoherence, the impossibility of communication between branches, changes everything about the emotional logic of the multiverse. Because if you cannot experience any other branch, then the existence of those other branches is, in practical terms, irrelevant to your life. Not irrelevant to physics, not irrelevant to the philosophy of what exists, but irrelevant to the question of what your life means to you, the one consciousness that will ever know it from the inside. Think of it this way. Imagine that right now, in a sealed room on the other side of the planet, a stranger is living a perfect life. They have everything you have ever wanted. Their days are filled with purpose, their evenings with warmth. You will never meet them, never hear about them, never know they exist. Does their happiness diminish yours? Most people, when they pause to consider it honestly, would say no. The existence of happiness elsewhere does not subtract from the happiness here. Comparison only activates when you become aware of the other person. And in the multiverse, awareness across branches is not just unlikely, it is physically impossible. This sealed quality, the very thing that might seem like a limitation, turns out to be what preserves the possibility of meaning. It is the wall around the garden that allows the garden to feel like a place rather than a point on an infinite grid. Without boundaries, meaning bleeds away in every direction, dissolving into the sheer volume of everything else. With boundaries, meaning can accumulate, it can deepen, it can become particular. The philosopher Martin Heidegger wrote extensively about the relationship between limitation and significance. For Heidegger, it is precisely because human existence is finite, bounded by birth and death, confined to a single perspective, that it carries weight. An immortal being, experiencing everything, would experience nothing fully. The edges are what create the center. The same logic applies to branches. A consciousness that could access every branch would be overwhelmed, not enriched, but dissolved. The way Evelyn's daughter was dissolved in that film, spread so thin across every possible experience that none of them retained any depth. Your confinement to one branch is not a punishment. It is the condition that makes experience possible at all. The walls are not keeping something from you. They are keeping you, the specific, located, irreducible you, intact. And here, a quiet inversion takes shape. The fear of being the worst version depends on comparison. Comparison depends on awareness of the alternatives. Awareness of the alternatives is physically prevented by decoherence, which means the fear is not based on information. It is based on imagination, the powerful, relentless, sometimes cruel imagination of a mind that can simulate alternatives it will never access. The multiverse, if it exists, is structured in a way that protects the one thing you need most to make life meaningful: the inability to see how it could have gone. That sealed quality is not indifferent. It is, in some sense, the architecture of meaning itself, a structure in which every branch gets to feel like the whole world, because from the inside it is. Here is an image that rarely appears in discussions about the multiverse, but perhaps it should. Imagine a mountain range, vast, stretching in every direction, and across every ridge, a different version of you is climbing. Some have gentle slopes, a well-marked path, clear weather. Others face steeper inclines, loose rock, thin air, storms that do not break. The version near the bottom, the one the mind instinctively labels worst, is not the one who stopped climbing. That version is still climbing, with less visibility, with heavier weight, on terrain that offers less grip and fewer resting points. And the fact that they are still moving, still breathing, still placing one foot ahead of the other, is not a mark of failure. It is, by any honest accounting, remarkable. There is a deep confusion embedded in the way worst gets applied to a life. The word implies an outcome, a final score, but lives are not outcomes. They are processes. They are ongoing. And the measure of a life in process is not where it stands on some external scale, but how it navigates the particular terrain it was given. A plant growing in poor soil does not represent a failed version of the same plant growing in rich earth. It represents the same life force expressing itself under harder conditions, and if anything, the adaptation required, the deeper root systems, the slower growth, the more efficient use of every scarce resource, speaks to a kind of resilience that the easier conditions never demanded. This is not meant to romanticize suffering. Suffering is real. It damages. It leaves marks that do not always heal. But the identification of suffering with inferiority is a separate claim, one that does not hold up under scrutiny. In psychology, there is a concept called post-traumatic growth. It describes the phenomenon where individuals who have endured significant hardship sometimes develop capacities they would not have developed otherwise: deeper empathy, clearer priorities, a more durable sense of what actually matters. This is not guaranteed, it is not universal, and it should never be used to justify inflicting suffering on anyone, but it points to something important. Difficulty and value are not opposites. They are sometimes collaborators. So consider the version of you that landed on the hardest branch, the one with the steepest gradient, the one that the late-night mind labels worst because it hurts the most and shows the least. That version did not choose their terrain. No version did. The branch was assigned by quantum decoherence, by molecular events too small to perceive, by a process that has nothing to do with merit or punishment. And within that branch, that version is doing something that no other version is doing in quite the same way. They are navigating the hardest version of the path, not because they are less, but because the path is more. And the word worst, which seemed so stable a few paragraphs ago, begins to shift. It starts to sound less like a description and more like a misunderstanding, a label generated by a mind that confuses difficulty with deficiency and terrain with the person standing on it. The mountain does not judge the climber. The gradient does not determine worth. And the version of you who is still going, right now, under the hardest conditions, might not be the worst of anything. They might simply be the one who was asked to do the most with the least. A candle in a dark room does not light the entire building. Its glow reaches a few feet in every direction and then stops, swallowed by the dark. No one looks at that candle and says it has failed. No one measures its worth by how much darkness remains unlit. The light is what it is. It fills the space it occupies, and within that space it is enough. Meaning might work the same way. There is a philosophical tradition, stretching from existentialism through pragmatism and into certain strands of contemporary thought, that argues meaning does not need to be universal to be real. It does not need to hold across every possible world, every possible branch, every possible version of a life. It only needs to hold here, in this room, in this particular strand of experience, for this particular consciousness. The French philosopher Albert Camus grappled with this directly. He faced the question that the multiverse sharpens to a point. If the universe is vast, indifferent, and possibly absurd, why keep going? His answer was not to deny the absurdity, but to live within it, to find meaning not in spite of meaninglessness, but alongside it, the way a swimmer finds rhythm not in spite of the current, but in response to it. Camus was not writing about quantum mechanics, but the emotional terrain is the same. The many worlds interpretation, if true, presents a reality in which meaning cannot be global. There is no single narrative that ties all branches together into a coherent story. Each branch generates its own story, its own arc, its own set of moments that matter to the people inside them. And this is where an unexpected kind of freedom appears. If meaning does not need to be universal, if it does not need to be validated by some cosmic structure or endorsed by every branch of reality, then you are free to build it locally, in your relationships, in your attention, in the specific quality of your awareness as you move through a single day in a single life. A conversation with someone you love is not less meaningful because, in another branch, that conversation never happened. A moment of clarity is not less real because, somewhere, a version of you is lost in confusion. The meaning resides in the experience, not in its uniqueness across the multiverse. This is harder to accept than it sounds. The mind wants its meaning to be big, to be written in the fabric of the cosmos, to be confirmed by the universe itself, and the multiverse seems to deny that confirmation by multiplying everything until nothing feels singular. But singularity was never where meaning lived. Meaning lives in attention, in the decision to care about this particular moment, this particular person, this particular thread. It is not diminished by the existence of other threads. It is constituted by your engagement with the one you are in. A candle does not fail because it is surrounded by darkness. It succeeds because it is a candle. And the meaning you build inside this branch, however small, however local, however invisible to the rest of the structure, is not a lesser meaning. It is the only kind that a consciousness inside a sealed branch could ever have. And it is, for that consciousness, the whole world. Of all the things the many worlds framework implies, there is one that hides quietly beneath the more dramatic conclusions. It is easy to miss because it runs counter to the intuition that the multiverse makes everything less special. In fact, it makes one thing extraordinarily special, and that thing is you. Not you in the general sense, not a type of person, not a category, but the specific, exact, unrepeatable configuration of consciousness that is reading this sentence right now. The precise sequence of memories, in this precise order, colored by this precise emotional tone, processed by this precise arrangement of neural connections, at this precise moment in the history of this precise branch. That configuration exists nowhere else. The many worlds interpretation exhausts possibilities. Every arrangement of particles that quantum mechanics allows is realized somewhere, but every arrangement does not mean every arrangement is repeated. It means every arrangement occurs once, in the branch where it occurs. Your counterparts are not duplicates, they are variations. Each one carries a slightly different history, a slightly different set of perceptions, a slightly different interior landscape. And by the time you reach this moment tonight, this exact moment, with everything that led to it, the cumulative divergence between you and even your closest counterpart is vast. Think of it like a path through a forest. Two people start at the same trailhead. One goes left at the first fork, the other goes right. By the time they have each walked for an hour, their surroundings are completely different. Different trees, different sounds, different light filtering through different canopies. They are both in the same forest, but they are not in the same place. You are not in the same place as any of your counterparts. You have not been in the same place since the first moment of divergence, which may have occurred before you were born, in a quantum event involving molecules in a cell that would eventually become part of your body. Everything since then, every perception, every emotion, every idle thought, has been specific to your branch and only your branch. In a structure that contains everything, the one thing it cannot contain is a repetition. If it could, the branches would not be distinct. The exhaustiveness of the multiverse is precisely what makes each branch unique. Every possible configuration occurs, which means no configuration needs to occur twice, and this includes the configuration that is you, not the you that your counterparts approximate, not the general outline of your life that might be recognizable across branches, but the fine-grained, moment-to-moment texture of what it feels like to be you, right now, in this body, in this room, at this hour, with this particular thought forming in your mind. That texture is singular, not in a metaphorical sense, in a structural one. The many worlds framework, by containing every possible version, guarantees that each version is irreplaceable. There is no backup. There is no second copy. The experience you are having tonight is happening once, in one branch, and will never be repeated, not because the universe is cruel, but because it is thorough, and the version of you that the late-night mind calls worst is, by this same logic, irreplaceable too. Not interchangeable with the better versions, not a lesser draft of a more polished self, but a pattern that exists nowhere else in the entire structure of reality, unrepeatable, unreplicable, and entirely its own. Long before anyone measured the spin of an electron or wrote an equation for the wave function, human beings were already living in a multiverse. Not a physical one, a neural one. Every night, when you replay the day and change one detail, what if I had said the other thing, taken the other road, made the other call? Your brain is constructing an alternate timeline. It is simulating a branch that diverged from your actual experience and running it forward to see where it leads. This process is so automatic, so deeply woven into the way human cognition works, that most people do not recognize it as extraordinary, but it is extraordinary. Cognitive scientists call it counterfactual thinking, and it appears to be a capacity that is either unique to humans or so rare in the animal kingdom that no other species demonstrates it reliably. Chimpanzees plan, crows use tools, dolphins recognize themselves in mirrors, but no non-human animal, as far as current research can tell, lies awake at night wondering how things might have been different. The neuroscience behind it involves a network of brain regions, the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, the default mode network, working together to construct scenarios that never happened. The same machinery you use to imagine the future is repurposed in counterfactual thought to reimagine the past, and the simulations are not faint sketches. They can be vivid, emotionally charged, and physiologically real. Your heart rate shifts, your breathing changes, your body responds to events that exist only inside your skull. This means the multiverse is not just a physicist's hypothesis, it is a psychological reality. Your brain is a branching machine. It generates alternate selves continuously, tests them against your values and fears, and uses the results to guide your behavior in the one branch you actually occupy. The pain of this process is real. Counterfactual thinking is the engine of regret, of guilt, of the relentless what-if that keeps insomniacs company, but it is also the foundation of something essential. Without the ability to imagine alternatives, you could not plan, you could not learn from mistakes, you could not empathize, because empathy requires simulating someone else's experience, which is just another form of branching inside your own mind. The multiverse you carry is not a copy of the physical one. It is smaller, rougher, shaped by emotion rather than quantum mechanics. But the structural similarity is striking. Both involve a reality that branches, both involve versions of events that diverge from a common origin, and both create the feeling of existing alongside paths you cannot access. Perhaps the mind was building this architecture long before physics gave it a name. There is a study that psychologists often reference when discussing the relationship between choice and happiness. In it, participants who were given fewer options reported greater satisfaction with their final selection than those who were given many. The researcher behind this work, Barry Schwartz, called it the paradox of choice. More options under certain conditions lead not to freedom but to paralysis, regret, and a persistent feeling that the choice you made was the wrong one. The mechanism is simple. When you have only two options, you can evaluate them both fully and move on. When you have 20, you cannot help but wonder about the 19 you left behind. And when you have infinite options, as the multiverse would imply, the potential for self-doubt becomes total. Every decision carries the shadow of every alternative, and every alternative is not just hypothetical but, in some theoretical sense, real. Now consider the structure of decoherence one more time. The branches are sealed permanently, irreversibly. You cannot see the alternatives. You cannot learn what happened to the version of you that chose differently. You are, in the deepest physical sense, protected from the information that would feed the comparison machine. This sealed quality begins to look less like a limitation and more like a mercy. Imagine for a moment that the walls were not there, that you could see into every branch, that you knew with perfect clarity how every other version of your life was unfolding, the one where you stayed, the one where you left, the one where you said yes, the one where you said nothing at all. The weight of that knowledge would be unbearable. Not because the other lives would be better, some would not, but because the comparison would never end. There would always be a branch doing something you wished you had done, and the mind, which already tortures itself with imagined alternatives, would be fed an infinite stream of real ones. The sealed walls of decoherence prevent this. They keep you in the only branch you can actually live. And by doing so, they create the conditions under which contentment is possible. Not guaranteed, not easy, but structurally possible, in a way it would not be if the walls came down. There is a deep irony here. The feature of the multiverse that seems most limiting, the impossibility of contact between branches, might be the feature that makes each branch livable. The ignorance is not a failing of the structure. It is a gift embedded in the physics. You do not know how the other versions are doing, and that not knowing, which feels like a loss when the mind focuses on it, is actually the quiet foundation beneath every moment of peace you have ever experienced. It is the reason you can enjoy a meal without knowing that, somewhere, a version of you is hungry. The reason you can laugh without knowing that, somewhere, a version of you is grieving. The kindness is structural. It is built into the architecture of branches. And tonight, as the comparing mind runs its familiar loops, it might be worth pausing to notice that the very inability to confirm your fears is also the thing that allows you to rest. Sometimes the hardest person to be kind to is yourself. Not because you lack the skill. Most people are remarkably good at comforting a friend who is struggling, at offering perspective to someone who feels like a failure, at pointing out what the other person cannot see about their own life. The difficulty arises when the person struggling is the one inside your own skin. The late-night mind is particularly brutal in this regard. It keeps a record. It knows every shortcut you took, every promise you broke, every time you fell short of the person you meant to be, and it does not present these failures with context. It presents them in a bare, unlit room, one after another, as though they are the sum total of who you are. Now add the multiverse to this courtroom. The mind does not just compare you to the person you were supposed to be, it compares you to every person you could have been, every branch where you made the right call, where you showed up, where things worked out. The imagined gallery of superior selves stretches in every direction, and the one version of you that seems to fall short of all of them is the one lying here, right now, listening. But here is the part the courtroom forgets to mention. No version of you chose their branch. The branch you are on was not assigned as a punishment. It was not selected because you deserved harder conditions. It was determined by quantum decoherence, by molecular interactions too small to perceive, too fast to influence, and too impersonal to carry any moral weight whatsoever. The terrain you walk on was never a reflection of your worth. It was a product of physics, and the version of you on the easiest branch did not earn their ease. The version on the hardest branch did not earn their difficulty. The distribution of conditions across the multiverse, if it exists, is as morally arbitrary as the distribution of rainfall across a landscape. Some fields are green not because they deserve it, but because the clouds happen to gather there. If you encountered another person, a friend, a stranger, someone you cared about, who was struggling under difficult circumstances they did not choose, you would not judge them for their position. You would not look at their pain and call it evidence of inferiority. You would offer what you could: understanding, warmth, the simple acknowledgement that difficulty is not the same as failure. The invitation tonight is to extend that same quality of attention inward, not as a technique, not as a self-help exercise, but as a recognition of something true. The version of you that the comparing mind calls worst is a person, a real, specific, experiencing person, navigating conditions they never chose, in a sealed branch they never selected, doing whatever they can with whatever they have. And that person, this person, is not the enemy. Rain falls on a field. It does not check first whether the field has been tended well. It does not withhold itself from weeds and offer more to flowers. It falls because the atmospheric conditions produced it, and it lands where the terrain directs it. There is no judgment in the process, no evaluation, no preference. The many worlds framework, if it describes reality accurately, operates with a similar indifference. Branches are generated by quantum decoherence. The process is governed by the Schrödinger equation, and that equation does not contain terms for better or worse. It does not distinguish between a branch where you succeed and a branch where you struggle. Both are solutions to the same mathematical structure. Both are equally valid. Both persist. There is no mechanism in the physics for ranking outcomes, no field in the equations that corresponds to quality of life, no variable that tracks whether a particular branch is worth more than another. The universe in this picture does not keep score. It simply evolves continuously, impartially, without favorites. This is different from saying the universe does not care. Caring and not caring are attitudes, and the universe does not have attitudes. It is more accurate to say the universe does not have the capacity to rank, in the same way that gravity does not have the capacity to judge. The force pulls everything equally. The equation evolves every branch equally. The structure does not contain the architecture for preference. So where does the ranking come from? It comes from consciousness, from the particular kind of awareness that human beings carry, the kind that evaluates, compares, and positions itself relative to imagined alternatives. The ranking is not a feature of reality. It is a feature of the mind that observes reality. And this means the feeling of being worst is not a discovery about your place in the multiverse. It is a production of your own cognitive machinery, projected onto a structure that does not recognize the projection. This is not a dismissal. The feeling is real. The suffering that accompanies it is genuine. But the story the feeling tells, that you have been measured and found wanting by some cosmic standard, is not accurate. There is no cosmic standard. There is only the internal standard, the one you carry, the one that was shaped by your particular history in your particular branch. And the remarkable thing about internal standards is that they are not fixed. They change, they soften, they deepen with experience, and sometimes with nothing more than the recognition of how they were formed. Tonight, the universe is not scoring your performance. It never has. The branches continue regardless of how you feel about your position among them. And the judgment you hear in the silence is not the voice of the cosmos. It is the voice of a comparing mind doing what it was built to do, measuring, positioning, evaluating, in a context where none of those operations apply. You can notice the voice without obeying it. You can hear the comparison without accepting its authority. And in that small gap between the thought and the belief in the thought, there is room for something quieter, something that does not need a score to know its own presence. The word worst has a finality to it. It sounds like a verdict, like a position at the bottom of a ladder that has already been measured, certified, and bolted to the wall. Once you are there, you are there. It feels permanent, but the branching structure of reality, if the many worlds framework is correct, does not recognize permanence in that way. It only recognizes the present moment as the edge of an evolving structure, and the future is not a continuation of a fixed ranking. It is a new set of branches, sprouting from exactly where you are right now. This is the temporal asymmetry that changes everything. The past has already been narrowed to one thread. It cannot be changed or revisited, but the future remains wide. It branches forward, and the label that the mind applied to your position based on the past has no authority over what happens next. Consider a river. At any given point, you can measure its speed, its depth, its direction. You can say, right now, this section of the river is shallow and slow. That is a description. It tells you about the current state, but it does not tell you about the waterfall that might be around the next bend, or the deep pool that might form where the terrain drops away. The measurement describes a moment, not a trajectory. Worst describes a moment. It is a snapshot of a position at a particular time, measured against a particular standard, from a particular perspective. And in a branching universe, the moment is always being replaced by a new one. Every quantum interaction generates new possibilities. Every second carries the potential for a branch that diverges from the pattern of everything that came before. This does not mean that things will necessarily get better. The future is not obligated to improve on the past. But it does mean that worst is a description that can only look backward. It can describe where you have been. It cannot describe where you are going, because the place you are going has not been generated yet. There is a profound difference between being at the bottom of a fixed ladder and standing at the edge of an evolving landscape. The ladder has a permanent bottom. The landscape does not. It changes shape with every passing moment, and the person standing on it is not positioned. They are moving, and movement, even in the hardest terrain, is not stagnation. Even the slowest step forward is a departure from the position that the mind labeled worst. Even the smallest breath taken in this new moment is an event that branches, a fresh divergence from the past, a new edge of possibility that did not exist a second ago. Tonight, the word worst might be sitting heavily on the chest, but it is a word that belongs to a moment that is already behind you. The next moment has not yet occurred, and in that gap, that thin, luminous space between what was and what is about to be, the label has no grip. You are not at the bottom of anything. You are at the forward edge of everything. Somewhere, right now, if the physicists who hold this framework are correct, countless versions of you exist, some in daylight, some in other seasons, some in rooms you have never seen, surrounded by faces you will never meet. But some of them, perhaps many of them, are doing exactly what you are doing right now, lying still, breathing, feeling the weight of the day begin to loosen, listening to something quiet, or simply letting the silence do its work. The image of the branching tree, which earlier carried the weight of comparison and fear, takes on a different quality when you slow down enough to look at it gently. Every branch continues, not just the ones that seem to be thriving, every single one. The branches that carry joy and the branches that carry difficulty, all of them persist. All of them stretch forward. None are abandoned by the structure that holds them. There is no branch that the universe forgets, no thread that is dropped, no version that ceases to be held by the same mathematics that holds every other version. The equation does not favor, it does not discard. It simply continues, steadily, patiently, including everything. And tonight, in this particular branch, the day is ending. Whatever happened, whatever weight you carried, whatever thoughts circled, whatever fears the comparing mind produced, the branch is still here, still continuing, still held. The other versions are not watching you from some higher vantage. They are not comparing. They are each inside their own moment, their own room, their own version of this same quiet hour, and every one of them is equally real, equally present, equally held by the same structure. There is something softening in that image, not because it changes your circumstances, but because it places them inside a context so large that judgment cannot survive the scale. Every branch lands somewhere, and tonight, this branch lands here, with you. There is a quality that specificity has, a quiet weight that generality can never match. The phrase "a beautiful evening" carries some warmth, but the memory of one specific evening, the exact color of the light, the particular sound, the precise feeling in your chest at that hour, carries something deeper, something that no description could fully transmit to another person, because it belongs entirely to the one who experienced it. The many worlds interpretation, if it is true, exhausts every generality, every type of evening, every category of experience, every possible variation of every possible moment. The general is fully covered. Nothing that could happen has been left out, but the particular, this particular, is yours alone, the way this moment feels from inside your body. The specific tiredness behind your eyes, the exact rhythm of your breathing, shaped by a day that no other version of you lived through in exactly this sequence. The thought forming in your mind right now, prompted by these words, colored by your history, arriving in a consciousness configured by billions of moments that only happened in this branch. No counterpart shares this moment. They have their own versions, equally real, equally particular, but not this one. This one belongs to the branch you are in, and to no other. There is a philosophical tradition that finds deep meaning in particularity. The Danish thinker Søren Kierkegaard spent much of his life arguing that existence is not an abstraction, it is always this existence, this individual, this moment. The universal may be interesting to think about, but it is the particular that you live. A multiverse of infinite scope does not erase the particular. It highlights it, because against a background of everything that could be, the one thing that is becomes luminous, not through comparison, not because it is better than the alternatives, but because it is the only version that your consciousness will ever touch. The room you are in, the breath you just took, the specific weight of this specific night. No version of reality, however vast, has a second copy of this, and that is not a small thing. That is an enormous thing, hidden in plain sight, quiet enough to miss unless you slow down enough to notice it. Tonight, you are particular, unrepeatable. Here, perhaps the deepest answer to the question, what if you are the worst version of yourself across all universes, is not an answer at all. It is a permission to stop asking, not because the question is wrong. It is a natural question, born from a natural mind, built from natural processes of comparison and evaluation that served your ancestors well on the savannah and serve you less well at 2 a.m. The question makes sense. It follows logically from the premises. If there are many versions, one must be worst. And the mind, always ready to volunteer for the lowest position, offers itself as a candidate. But notice what the question does. It takes the entire irreducible richness of your existence, every joy, every failure, every quiet Tuesday afternoon that no one will ever write about, and compresses it into a rank, a single position on a scale that does not exist, measured by a standard that no branch of the multiverse could produce, evaluated by a judge that the physics does not contain. The question asks you to become a data point, and you are not a data point. You are a field, a landscape, a weather system. You contain contradictions, surprises, seasons that have not yet arrived. Reducing all of that to a position on a cosmic scoreboard is not clarity. It is compression, and what gets lost in the compression is everything that matters. So here is the permission. You do not have to rank yourself. You do not have to know where you stand among your counterparts. You do not have to resolve the question at all. You can simply set it down, the way you set down a heavy object that you have been carrying for no reason, not throwing it away, not pretending it never existed, but gently placing it on the ground and straightening your back. The question will still be there in the morning if you want it. The multiverse, if it exists, will still be branching. The counterparts, if they are real, will still be living their sealed and separate lives. But tonight, in this branch, in this room, the comparison can rest, not because it has been answered, but because you have decided, just for now, that it does not need to be. And in that decision, small, private, unwitnessed by any version of you in any other world, there is something that might be called freedom. The branching tree stretches in every direction. You have seen its shape tonight, through physics, through philosophy, through the long corridor of the comparing mind. You have walked along its edges and looked into the spaces between the branches, where the questions live and the answers are still forming, and now the tree is quieting, not because it has stopped growing. Somewhere, at scales too small to see, new branches are still emerging. New versions of this moment are still being generated. The universe, if this picture is accurate, has not paused, but from inside this particular branch, the motion begins to feel less like expansion and more like settling, like the way a lake looks after the wind stops. Still moving, technically, but calm enough to reflect. You are one leaf on this tree, not the highest, not the lowest. Those positions do not exist in the way the mind imagines them. You are simply a leaf, held by the branch you are on, connected, through the trunk, to every other leaf in the structure, not competing with them, not compared to them, just growing in the direction that the light reaches you. And the trunk holds every branch equally. It does not pull nutrients from the lower branches to feed the higher ones. It does not label one section as worthy and another as waste. It simply holds. That is its nature, to carry everything that grows from it without preference. If there is one thought worth carrying into sleep tonight, it might be this: the version of you that exists right now is not a rough draft. It is not a lesser edition of a better self. It is a complete expression of a unique set of conditions, physical, quantum, experiential, that has never occurred before and will never occur again. And the fact that other expressions exist elsewhere does not diminish this one. It cannot, because diminishment requires comparison, and comparison requires access to what is being compared. And the branches are sealed, so sleep can come. The comparing mind can soften, the question can rest. You are not the worst version of anything. You are the only version of this. And this breath, this room, this body, this quiet unfolding moment is not a position on a scale. It is a place, a real, particular, gently continuing place, and it is yours. Good night.